Okay. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I'm Milena Aguiar, and I'll be helping out this webinar today. Just a few warnings before we start. After the presentation, we will have time for questions. You can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom page. Please use the option sent to everybody, not only to the presenter, because I'll be helping with these questions later. I'd like to welcome Michael Thompson, who will present the webinar today. Michael, please introduce yourself and start. And it's your show now.
Thank you so much. My name is Michael Thompson. I'm a water resource engineer at the Delaware River Basin Commission, and I'll explain what all that is in a little bit. Thank you for having me. I know a lot of the folks on the call, so it's good to see you again. And those I don't know, thank you for being here. So today I'm going to be talking about a recent publication that the Commission put out on data collected through our water audit program. And the title of this talk is also just the title of the report. It's a comprehensive assessment of the Delaware River Basin Commission's water audit program. And those are the date ranges I'm looking at, 2012 to 2021. So, because this is a bit of a broader audience than I normally speak to, I wanted to give some perspective about where I am talking about. So, stepping back to the beginning, this is Earth, and it's a pretty cool place to live. I've kind of put a statement there, what we have is what we've got, and that's simply just meaning this is it. When you look at the broad picture, we're not getting more water, we're not getting more Earth. What we have is what we've got, and if we ruin it or run out or we can't access the things we need, that's kind of it. So it's important to use what we have wisely, right? The Delaware River Basin is on the eastern coast of the United States. It's situated kind of near Philadelphia and New York. It's roughly 13,500 square miles, and it's right in this kind of urban corridor, so about 8.6 million people live within the basin's boundary. And I just wanted to give some kind of quick facts, some big highlights. The main stem of the river is about 330 miles long, and it forms an interstate boundary basically over its entire length. So anytime you're standing on one side of the river and looking across the river, you're basically looking at a different state. And 330 miles is also one of the longest undammed rivers east of the Mississippi. There's a bunch of dams on the tributaries, but there is no dam on the main stem river, which has a lot of implications for things like salt water coming up from the bay and how we can have fresh water go down to repel the salt from things of that nature. As I mentioned, it's about 13,500 square miles over 4 states, which is 0.4% of the United States land area. And while 8.6 million people live here, over 14 million people rely on the basin's water for drinking water, which is about 4% of the United States population. So it's 0.4% of the land area and 4% of the population. Water withdrawals overall, not just public water supply, are about 6.5 billion gallons a day. There's major exports of drinking water to New York City. It gives like half of New York City its drinking water. It has a lot of contributions to the economic region, over $21 billion in economic value. That's from an older study, which is probably outdated at this point. And it supports a massive amount of electrical generation, 98 terawatts of energy in 2020. When you look at a Huck-6 scale, it's like second in the country in terms of the amount of energy generated in a small area. So it's really important that the waters are cooling that energy generation. So I'm sure a lot of folks are like, well, what is the Delaware River Basin Commission? And this is the slide where you can wonder no more. So I'll just note we have 4 different states in the Delaware River Basin. And like I mentioned, the river forms an interstate boundary. So with so many competing interests and a number of external factors, it was realized that they needed a regional body with the force of law to oversee kind of a unified approach in order to manage the river system without regard to political boundaries. So no one's making decisions kind of in their own interest. You're making it as a group. So it would benefit all the parties involved. And in 1961, The commission was created via interstate compact in the United States, which is basically like an interstate agreement, which cannot be done according to the United States Constitution without the federal government being involved. So we have 4 commissioners, 1 from each state, and then we also have the federal government. So 5 total commissioners, typically represented by the governors or the respective environmental agency designees. So while the boundary is about 13,500 square miles, as I mentioned, it's a small portion of the United States. And we at DRBC typically estimate what we call a population served, or the number of people who rely on the water from the basin for drinking water. And in 2020, when the new census came out, the revised estimate was 14.2 million people. And that's a lot of people. And this graphic is just kind of showing you how that was calculated. You have the portions of people who live within each state, and then we're accounting for the major exports of drinking water out of the basin, then a small, relatively small import into the basin, which is the major import that we have of drinking water. When all is said and done, it comes out to about 14.2 million people. And then focusing specifically on the basin, because that's what this report focuses on. It doesn't really get into those out-of-basin exports. We're really focused on the people living within the basin and the public water suppliers within the basin. I mentioned there's about 8.6 million people who live within the boundary of the basin. Most of those people, 7.3 million people, are estimated to be served by public water supply. And the way we did that was by looking at the geographic information data we have on public water supply boundaries, which are kind of shown on this map here in green. So you can see all around kind of this corridor of this heat map of population, where you can see Philadelphia's very populated center. It's just a whole lot of public water supply. Everyone's relying on public water supply. And overall in the basin, it's about 85% of that population is being served by some kind of public water supplier. So it's a lot going on within the basin. To just give some context of like what that infrastructure looks like, on the left-hand side here, I've given 2 stats. In total, with the audits that DRBC receives, it accounts for about 29,000 miles of water main, which is roughly enough to circle the earth, and 2.5 million service connections, active and inactive. So it's a lot of infrastructure going on in the Delaware River Basin, and really just highlights how extensive and essential public water supply is within the basin. So I mentioned that DRBC, the Delaware River Basin Commission, has a water audit program. I've just kind of put this like quick timeline here on the right with some key points. In 2000, IWA publishing the standardized methods for doing a water balance, and then kind of running through some standardized terminology, some KPIs. I know some folks on the call were involved in that, so probably familiar. In 2006, DRBC staff participated with AWWA's Water Loss Control Committee to help develop the first version, the Microsoft Excel workbook called the Free Water Audit Software. And then between 2007 and 2009, DRBC underwent a formal rulemaking process, which is an extensive process to get all 4 states to agree to create a new law, where basically systems that distribute supplies in excess of an average of 100,000 gallons a day in any 30-day period are going to need to fill out this water audit report and submit it annually. And then by 2013, the first reports were due, covering the year 2012. So that kind of leads us to today. DRBC has published numerous snapshots of the water audit program, summarizing years of data. But then in 2023, we kind of published this first comprehensive assessment of the data that we've collected, which at that point was 10 years. There's a lot of information in the report. And in the talk today, I'm going to kind of step through some of the bigger sections and touch on what I can in the time I have. But the report is bookmarked very well. So if you download the PDF, you can like jump around if you open the navigation pane and hopefully find whatever you're looking for. So section 3, basically just looking at the data, how we managed it. What does the data look like? So diving in head first. Over the course of the years, the number of audits DRBC expected to be submitted was around 300. You can probably see from this table, we never received the full 300, but compliance in terms of folks submitting their reports has generally hovered in a good like mid 90 range since kind of the midway mark in this program. The data set starts in 2012, runs through 2021, and it spans 4 different versions of the AWWA free water audit software, which poses some challenges in itself. But before running any of the analysis, we had to do a few things to kind of vet this data. We housed it all in a spreadsheet, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it was kind of tough to back out all the calculations in the audit software so that we could manually correct things when we're looking at 10 years of data. If someone has a unit error that's very obvious, we can correct that without going back to the audit software, recompiling it, bringing it back in. You can just change the cell value right there and all the calculations carry forward. So that was pretty helpful. And then when assessing annual metrics, with unit rates, it's not really a big deal to have missing data because you're generally looking at statistics when you're looking at things like unit rates. But when you're looking at volumetric trends, it's really, you can't have gaps in the data because then missing data becomes apparent as trends. So we really just ran an algorithm to backfill any missing reports with the nearest previous year of data, which is kind of shown on the bottom there. Then I guess what we would do is use this filtering criteria. If we're going to look at KPIs such as unit rates, we really wanted to look at what we would consider the best data, because I'll say this data set that we collect is just submitted. It's filled out and submitted. It's not really level 1 validated or anything like that. As I mentioned, we've done some QA on our side, but when we're looking at statistics like KPIs and unit rates, for that purpose, we ran through these, I guess, 5 filtering criteria to pull out what we would consider the highest quality data to be looking at statistics in terms of what's going on. So how does this QA, QC'd and filtered data compare to level 1 validated data? So this series of figures is generated using the AWWA Water Audit Reference Dataset, WARD, which has data from 3 different programs, all of which are level 1 validated, and they're color-coded there on the left from Quebec, California, and Georgia. Each plot gives the relationship between real losses and one of these independent variables, such as the number of connections, the length of mains, the pressure, and the average length of service line. And then, based on those 3 colors, we can overlay data from DRBC's calendar year 2021 reports. Only the filtered data, the highest quality data that's passing through those filters, which ends up being 209 out of 300 reports. And we can plot that on top of the WARD data in those blue points. And we didn't run any kind of like comparison statistics or quantitative analysis, but we really just qualitatively said, well, the filtered data that we have looks good in terms of these distributions compared to level 1 validated data. So we think it's adequate in terms of just moving forward with some of these statistical analyses that we're interested in looking at. So that's a quick run through of the data and how we managed it. Sections 4 and 5 of the report are really getting into like, what is the current day snapshot? That would be 2021. And if we can look at any trends throughout the basin in terms of these different water loss components. So basin-wide 2021, what's happening in the basin? We assessed the most recent year. This water balance is aggregated data for all 300 systems because we're looking at the volumetric picture. So we don't want to exclude backfill data. We have all the systems that we expect. So it's 300 systems. They took on average about 779 million gallons a day. And because we're in the US, this is just the standard unit. We end up using million gallons per day. Kind of similar to cubic feet per second. I think the conversion is like 1.5 or something. So it's similar. But based on the aggregate imports and exports, we then can conclude that the rate of water supplied is about 795 million gallons a day. And everyone, and I don't know if everyone's already doing it, but you may be pulling out your calculator and trying to run the math. So I'll just save you the trouble and say 209 over 795 is about 26%. So it's a lot of water that we're talking about. And while most of the water is authorized consumption, there is a decent chunk that's being lost basin wide. The last column breaks these losses down, and surprisingly, most of the lost water, 182 million gallons on average, are real losses. And something that's generally not included in these water balances, but what I presented at Null and what we've put in this report and what I feel are important is this UARL value, the unavoidable annual real losses. Because from my experience, when the number 182 is presented by itself, I feel like the public is kind of misguided into thinking that all that can be resolved. They say, well, you're losing 182 million gallons. That's unacceptable. You shouldn't lose any water. So by incorporating this UARL value, even though it's theoretical, it at least speaks to this concept that all systems are going to leak no matter how hard you try. So in doing so, even if everyone were to try their best, there's still going to be in aggregate about 42 million gallons a day of real losses. And then by subtraction, you get this 141 million gallons a day number, which I just called avoidable because it's the antonym to unavoidable. I don't know that that's the best term. There's probably better terms. You know, again, it's avoidable in the fact that it's not theoretically the UARL, but is it feasible to eliminate it all? Gets into a whole other question. So this is the basin-wide picture for 2021. And before moving into kind of more statistics on like the real losses or the KPIs, I just wanted to step back because again, the data is not level 1 validated, but I did want to speak to something from the AWWA software called data validity. And this is probably something everyone's been asked at some point in their life. I know I ask my 6-year-old like 20 times a day, are you sure? And that's kind of the concept of data validity. I love the Far Side comic by Gary Larson, so I've brought in this comic here kind of explaining what data validity is. If you're trying to escape from prison and you have a really solid plan in your opinion, such as the number of sheets you need to rappel down the wall, the time it takes you to get across the prison yard, the height your tunnel needs to be, and the length your tunnel needs to be to escape your prison, that's great. You have all the data you need and you're really confident in the first 3. So you're digging your tunnel, you're almost out. Your tunnel length data was not quite as great an input as you had hoped. And you see here, they think it's rain and it's quite unfortunate what happens. So data validity and the quality of your data is really important when you're looking at these analyses. So that's the basic idea behind it. If you're not familiar with the AWWA free water audit software, every input gets a grade from 1 to 10, basically saying how trustworthy your data is. 1 is not good, 10 is very reliable. At the end, you get a full grade from 0 to 100. They bin these into data validity tiers, which are kind of shown on this plot here. And what I'm showing on these bars is basically the total water supplied by all the systems that are binned to each of these data validity tiers. I've given you the total water supply number, and then N equals is the number of systems falling within each tier. So just over 50% of the total water supplied is being attributed to 77 reports that we see with a data validity score and a tier of 4 or 5. So it's really basically high quality data, like they're pretty sure of the inputs. And then a lot are still falling in tier 3 and tier 2, which definitely highlight that there is some room for improvement, which is likely not a surprise. And it's interesting because version 6 of the free water audit software includes this interactive data grading questions. And we can look into some of that data a lot deeper, such as pressure. I don't know if there's any Queen fans, but Freddie Mercury and David Bowie have a really good song about pressure, so that's why he's on here. So I've noted at the bottom here in section 4.3 of the report, it dives into some analyses of these interactive data grading questions, but I just wanted to highlight what some of that looks like for pressure. All these systems that submit the reports are answering these questions on how confident they are in their pressure data. And while a single pressure value for an entire system may leave some data enthusiasts like wanting more, it's still a critical parameter that we have, and sometimes simple is better. So consequently, it's important to understand how some of these values came about, and it may help DRBC in the future focus efforts on how we can have outreach and educate in terms of improving this data. Because this chart here is simply a number of systems by the calculation method of the average operating pressure. And what stands out just from off the bat is this guesstimated. There's a large number of systems who are just guessing at the average pressure. And this really helps highlight some low-hanging fruit where maybe we can improve data in the future. All right, so back to losses. I've kind of given the overall view of the basin in 2021, touched on the data validity a bit. There's a lot more in section 4.3 of the report on the data validity. Like we get into the answers on the top 3 limiting factors in some of these critical fields. So it's pretty interesting. But yeah, data validity is important. Getting back to real losses, the chart on the top here is showing volumetrically the total real loss over time. So the first impression that you might have could be that the trend is increasing overall, which was my initial thought as well. But then we can look at individual years and their deviation from the 10-year mean value, which is shown on the table on the bottom. The story then seems to become that real losses have remained relatively constant with increases over the last 2 years. And I've color-coded this table such that white is like you're right in the middle at your 0 deviation from the 10-year mean. Red would be like you're very high above the mean, so your real losses are high for that year compared to the time series. Blue is you're below it. So you can really see the prevalence of red cells near the last 2 years. So in the report, we asked a few questions and we tried to dive into it a little bit, like why could this have happened? Would it be the switch to version 6.0 of the software, which seems unlikely? It just happened to correlate with this timing. We don't think that was it, but we looked at it. We thought about atmospheric temperatures, such as extreme colds. Could these have been like anonymously cold years? But again, that didn't really seem like the case. These are just like really high level qualitative analyses. We also looked at the impacts of COVID-19, possibly forcing water into different areas within distribution systems more frequently, such as sending water to homes more routinely, and maybe there's higher rates of breaks at the homes than the larger commercial facilities, which seemed promising, and there's a lot of research coming out on that. And I can say anecdotally, we haven't published it yet, but calendar year 2022, the real losses appear to have decreased again from 21, going back towards the 10-year average. So it really does seem like those 2 years might end up just being higher. And who knows, maybe it was attributed to COVID-19. Who knows? We'll find out in the future, maybe with some more research. So it's also possible to look at these real loss data as one of the more targeted KPIs, such as the normalized rate of real losses. A lot of folks on the call are probably familiar with the gallons per connection per day. The trend overall, these are just box plots for all the systems that pass that filter criteria again, because now we're looking at statistics. So we don't want to use backfilled data. We only want to use the higher quality data. So I've given you the number of reports passing the filter, the n equals value for each year, and then the distribution of just all systems over the years. The trend, I guess, if you want to call it that, is relatively stable, about 50 gallons per connection per day. But as you can see, there is quite a large distribution and quite some outliers. If it were color coded by system class, you could see the differences. It's tough. There are a million ways to present this data. I think we've broken it down a couple more ways in the report, but I'm just trying to show some highlights here without taking up like 50 slides on the same metric. All right, so that was kind of the current picture, a look at some trends in the basin. In section 6 of the report, we thought about, okay, well, what is the real loss reduction potential? Are there any analyses we can do? Like, what does it mean when folks are losing 182 million gallons a day? How much could be recovered? Can any of it be recovered? Most of it, some of it? What does it look like? So there's going to be a lot on the slide. I'm just going to work through it. I'm trying to, again, condense a lot of detailed stuff into a few slides. So the first method we looked at, we tried in order to estimate a real loss reduction potential, which is that RLRP abbreviation up there, was a frontier analysis. And the general procedure that we followed is highlighted by these bulleted items here. We're just trying to develop a multivariate model, basically a multivariate model to estimate the predicted real loss based on some independent variables that we have. Then we look at how the results are distributed. We set some percentiles and like, okay, most folks are performing at about this percentile. We call that average. And then you set a good and a very good, and then we're calculating real loss reduction potential if like folks who are performing worse than good started to get better. So in this model that we developed, we just chose the components of UARL to develop this equation just in hopes that it would tie into some of the concepts about where and how leaks are theoretically occurring. It also allowed us to do a simple linear regression between the predicted real losses and the UARL value. So we could actually just say, incorporate this bottom line where it's like that red line is theoretically the relationship of the UARL to this model. So it was neat to be able to bring that in as well. So we developed the model. It's kind of shown here on the table on the bottom left. Basically, this chart on the right here is plotting the observed real losses, what we got reported versus the modeled real losses. So the equation is kind of inherently represented by this black line, the 1-to-1. But really it is just the 1-to-1 line. You call this ratio, the cross plot ratio, the OP ratio, observed to predicted. And then basically we look at how those ratios are distributed around the black line, which is this second chart over on the right. We fit a log normal distribution to it, and then we're able to pull out some percentiles. So then you can say, okay, the average system according to the model is performing on that black line. There's a bunch who are performing better than the model. They're on the purple line. There are a bunch who are performing even better. They're on the blue line. Theoretically, most should not be getting below the red line because that's kind of related to the UARL. Then just zooming in on one system, what this real loss reduction potential is, my exciting animation there. I'll even go back to replay it. Boom. The real loss reduction potential is the amount of water which could possibly be reduced should one of those systems who are operating at a certain level start performing better. And what is that volume? So we could look at the results basin-wide. If everyone above the average value were to improve their operation to get down to that average value, how much water could be saved in terms of real losses. And then you see the total down here at the very last row, 95, 117, 136, and 144 in million gallons per day. And apparently, or logically, as you approach that UARL, you're just kind of eliminating all the real losses, and it would be that close to that 141 number that we mentioned on the water balance. Some challenges with the frontier analysis that we kind of realize are that unless you're using this in conjunction with UARL like we did, you won't get that red line, or you might not get that red line. I don't know. We didn't do it a different way. It's how we did it. So I like that we were able to incorporate UARL in these kind of theoretical limits. It's not really economical for all systems to reduce to the same level. based on the cost of basically performing leak detection and repairs and all that. So this concept might be referred to as the economic level of leakage. And I've given that chart that Alan Lambert originally put together, I guess, in the paper in 1999. Basically a concept that there is a point at which your return on investment is not going to be great. So not everyone's going to be chasing the last drop of water that's leaking. And I know that this is a bit of a basic concept and there are benefits extending beyond the original ELL kind of concept, but this is just being used for illustrative purposes here. So lastly, this sort of frontier analysis is also subject to a great deal of change year to year because you're using percentiles. So especially if the systems are improving. So reanalyzing that regression after everyone has changed, it's like system A, for example, they're really bad and they get down to average and they're like, yeah, I made it to average. And then you rerun the regression and all of a sudden average becomes like a lot lower because everyone's doing better and they're no longer average. Now they're bad again. So it's a bit tough from that perspective. And we thought, is there another way that we could be doing this? We got into looking at the infrastructure leakage index as what we found to be a really good alternative. IOI being the real loss over the UARL. We've cross-plotted real losses, observed real losses versus UARL, and then you're inherently looking at the IOI on the plot. So the black line there, the 1-to-1, is a constant line of IOI equals 1. Offsets from that black line are therefore different tiers of IOI. And ultimately, this is just like a very reduced level of effort from a frontier analysis, and it might be more digestible of an analysis to take in. It's certainly easier to explain, especially if you're familiar with IOI and UARL. If you're not, then it might be some background information that you need. But a huge benefit here is that this inherently captures the research and theory behind UARL, which I really like. Another benefit is that when you consider that not everyone's going to chase a ILI of 1, you're going to consider things like economics. When you look at an economic level of leakage, that value can often be reported as an ILI value. And that also helps us in terms of planning. And again, just noting that everyone above an ILI of 10, reducing to an ILI of 10, we can run those kind of analyses and get a basin-wide picture again. And some folks are like, hey, what's up with those ILIs less than 1? What's going on there? Good eye, yes, it's likely a function of maybe 2 things: less than reliable data, and those square points are ones that were filtered out. So that could be it. Or they might be below the recommended limits on application of the standard UARL equation, because I just applied it to everyone. I didn't care if they had 500 connections. I just threw it in there to run the analysis as it is for the basin with these caveats in place. So good eye. What does this look like for the basin? We can get a similar table of results to our frontier analysis. And now it's just showing if everyone above a 10 made it to a 10, everyone above a 5 made it to a 5, everyone above UARL made it to UARL. That would be great. So it's interesting to see that we can kind of compare these 2 scenarios here, which is this middle block of text, where a real loss reduction potential of about 93 million gallons a day. With the frontier analysis, that was like everyone meeting the average performance. But also in the ILI analysis, it's like everyone meeting an ILI of 3. So that's interesting to see that we're getting comparable results. It's probably because we set up our multivariate equation using components of UARL. Again, we didn't do a different frontier analysis, so I can't say if it were to change if we did a different equation, but I found this useful to justify, in my mind, just using this ILI method and sticking with that. Again, there's some challenges. The real world does not operate where all systems meet a certain threshold together. What did I do? Go back? Yeah. They don't meet a certain threshold together. So again, for planning, this is really for planning purposes when we're looking at how much water could possibly be saved. In my mind, incorporation of this economic level of leakage, even for just really large systems, what are driving a lot of these trends, would be super helpful in terms of planning, because we know that these large old systems are not reaching an ILI of 1, and it's not realistic to expect that they would, and it's not realistic to plan for. So we know that we're not going to be targeting 144 million gallons a day in reduction. So incorporating things like an ELL analysis would really help from a planning perspective in terms of resiliency and sustainability of these water resources. It's also noted that simply changing the average operating pressure on the same system year to year can affect the calculation of ILI and therefore kind of where you're landing on these analyses. Although I will say that changing the pressure should also inherently affect the volume of water lost, because it's the orifice equation, pressure differential inside, outside the pipe, water flowing through the pipe. So it should theoretically correct itself. So just wanted to mention that again. Right, moving on. Lastly, regarding these cross plot analyses, I just wanted to highlight that it can be presented in unit rates, which I really like, and I thought a lot of folks here might also really like, because now you got your KPI observed real losses in gallons per connection per day. You've tied in a real loss reduction potential. Cross plot is kind of easy to view. And there's a couple things going on here. The y-axis, again, fairly well known, real losses, gallons per connection per day observed, and then you just convert the UARL into gallons per connection per day, throw that on the x-axis. It's the same cross plot, just normalized. And in my mind, it's a useful diagnostic tool, especially when you're looking at a lot of systems like we have shown on the chart here, because you can see the systems are no longer grouped by class. If I go back here, you can see the color bands basically based on system class. And when you normalize it, they all kind of get intermingled and grouped together. Now, it can easily be seen that multiple systems of different sizes operating at the same level of real loss rate, say 100 gallons per connection per day or slightly higher, are not actually performing at the same efficiency. Some have the potential to reduce a lot farther than others, whereas some on the right are performing at like an ILI of 2. You got some on the left, it's like, oh, they're also at 100 gallons per day. They're doing great. Well, not necessarily, because their ILI is like 10, meaning they're losing like 10 times as much water as theoretically might be possible. So it's really helpful to know that 100 and 100 may not be equal in all cases. And I've also noted on here that there's a couple ways that systems can kind of move on this chart, right? So as systems optimize their pressure management or reduce their pressure, the UARL calculation reduces. But given the same holes in the pipes, real losses should also reduce according to the orifice equation. So reductions in pressure would likely move a point toward the origin, although it might not be along the one-to-one slope, right? And what's great with this visualization is that even if the ILI were to increase, which would be that top track here, you start with an ILI of 6 and your real loss is 90 gallons per day. You're like, awesome, I did some pressure management, I reduced my overall system pressure, my leakage went down. Oh, my ILI went up to 8. And that's just an inherent calculation thing. Well, on this chart, you're still seeing that the real losses in gallons per connection per day decreased to 75. So it's not a bad thing, right? You have reduced leakage. It's just a way to actually intermingle these two things and see how systems are improving that I really like. All right, real loss reduction potential. So what does this mean? We can start by kind of looking at the trend in withdrawals over time. This chart is showing data from the Delaware River Basin Commission, all public water suppliers over time since 1990, withdrawing a decreasing trend in water. I've added on the calendar year 2021 data, kind of color coded by the water audit component. And then I've overlaid the real loss reduction potentials by ILI threshold, basically understanding, okay, the trend that we had projected of these operating systems may end up in 40 years, just kind of reaching this standard ILI of 7. Are there ways to kind of adjust this? Is there a point maybe like ILI of 8, ILI of 5 or 3, something at some point, population increase is just going to make it where the public water supply trend is going to start increasing again. This is just a really helpful planning tool for us when we're talking about a large area and a lot of systems. Again, just another quick slide on like, so what? Why do we care about the real loss reduction potential? Tangentially, in our planning section, we're also working on things like surface water availability models, things that look at an exact surface water withdrawal point. And if we have a repeat of the drought of record, which is a period from us from like the 1960s, a really low flow period, are there going to be problems at that surface water intake? If there are problems, do they have enough water? And if they're short, how much water might they be missing on certain days in the summer of a repeat drought of record? Do they have strategies at mitigating those problems, like alternate sources? But again, it's a drought. It's not just like a drought on one source, it's regional. So it might affect more things. Do they have interconnections they can rely on? But again, regional. So everyone's probably going to be dealing with similar issues. Or can we look at how much real loss reduction potential they have, the leakage they currently have, start investing in the infrastructure improvements, reduce their leakage, and kind of mitigate that future scenario of a repeat drought of record. And then all of a sudden they're not short water when that time comes around. So interesting applications, I think, basin-wide here. I'm running out of time. I think I got like 5 minutes left, and I got a couple short sections. So I'm going to touch on some things. And if I run out, I'll just kind of cut it short. Just let me know how I'm doing, Melanie. We ran a pilot study, and so that was kind of the real loss reduction. Yes.
That's okay for now. I think 5 more minutes, and then we can open for the questions. We don't have any questions now at the Q&A.
Yeah, it's a lot.
So, so feel free to keep talking. I'll let you know if we have more questions in 5 minutes, okay?
Sounds good. Thank you. So the real loss reduction potential is kind of like a big idea in this new report. Is something new to DRBC that we just kind of put out in this study. We did a couple other things, one of which is this concept of UARL and system correction factors. We kind of ran this pilot study, and just as a quick refresher, a lot of folks are probably familiar with this stuff, so I won't go too far into it. We have the concept of UARL. I really like how the equation was described or how it was formulated, and I've kind of highlighted it here and color coded that it's really not just some empirical relationship, but it was really more than that, based on assessments of like, where is the water leaking? How does it leak? Can we look at a bunch of really well operated systems? They used data from 27 water systems in 20 countries. They developed all these coefficients. You stitch it together in this equation, and it performs very well, right? It's kind of proven itself over the 25 years it's been out there. There are recommended limits on using this equation, which are based on the input data, and that makes sense for any model you develop. You don't really want to go outside the constraints of the model. So those coefficients, to the best of my knowledge, in US units are kind of presented there at the bottom. And I mentioned before, I just applied UARL to all systems in the basin, and I was just running with it. I did highlight which ones theoretically were outside of those recommended limits because they didn't pass the filter, but I ran with it. We did want to pilot this idea of a system correction factor, which is research which is ongoing with Alan Lambert and Kate Stanton-Davies, who are on the call now. And thank you very much for helping me and DRBC with this pilot study. I think it turned out really well. It was pretty neat. It's current research trying to show a dimensionless correction factor that can be applied to the UARL equation by modifying some of these underlying assumptions. And I've given these 3 kind of high-level assumptions here, one of which is that there's a relationship between pressure and the leakage flow rate, specifically related to the material of pipe you're looking at, rigid or flexible material. This concept of a fixed and variable area discharge, FAVOD, if you're in the know and really want to go for the abbreviations. The second thing is that it's really specific to small systems, right? Because of those constraints. If you're less than 5,000 connections, that was one of the recommended constraints. So for small systems, noting that there's a different pattern of breaks in terms of probability than large systems, so trying to account for that. And then investigating the relationship between pressure and burst frequencies. Kind of when you get all that additional data that you need, it's like 3 terms. You can get this dimensionless correction factor, adjust the UARL value, and get a more realistic picture of where the system is performing in terms of like how low they could actually go, right? So we ran this pilot study for a few systems with New Jersey American who had a good handle on data for 5 relatively small systems. And we thank you very much to New Jersey American for helping us with this. Totally volunteer, it was great. We got the supplemental data that we needed for these analyses kind of in this second block of data here. We get these system correction factors based on the combination of those assumptions being modified. And then down at the very bottom, you get a corrected UARL value and you can get a corrected ILI. And in 2 cases, we found that one system went from an unrealistic theoretical minimum performance of like an ILI less than 1. So their initial ILI was 0.82 if you're looking at system 2 there. And then when you correct that UARL calculation, you use the same observed real loss. It just turns out, oh, it's a 1.15. That makes a little more sense. They're performing very efficiently rather than like theoretically below that limit. So that kind of did what it was intended to do, which was nice to see. And then only in the other example, only when pressure was on the high end of the recommended range did it actually increase the UARL value, again, due to those underlying assumptions. So ultimately, beneficial pilot study. We liked it and we reported out in this publication. This is, I think, my last section. Section 10, we did some physiographic analyses because of the New Jersey State Water Plan. They said, well, there's leakage rates that are different in the north of the basin than the coastal plain of the basin. And we were like, that's a really good point. We can probably look at that. So basically, is there some relationship between the physiographic province? We assume it's related to the elevation differentials because I've given kind of the snapshot of the 4 different province or the 5 different provinces, right? All the way down to the coastal plain and then coastal plain, which is like flat sandy area, Appalachian Plateau, kind of more mountainous. And I've given the cross section there on the bottom left. So you can just see when you're in the Appalachian Plateau, there's a lot of elevation relief. You get down to the coastal plain and it's just kind of flat, right? So is there a difference? We looked at elevation data underlaid or overlaid on these service area GIS data shapes and clipped the data of elevation to these service areas, looked at the highest elevation, the lowest elevation, called that a service area elevation differential, and then used that as a proxy variable to see how that kind of correlates with real loss data. The first step, we looked at it by physiographic province, and I think it really speaks volumes when you just look at like, yes, the elevation differential makes a lot of sense because when you're in the coastal plain, there's not a lot of elevation difference over your service area as compared to the regions in the mountains. And then you can also look at it normalized, but again, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to keep going. Then we looked at the elevation differential compared to the reported average operating pressure. And that was pretty interesting to see that up until about 150 feet of elevation differential, you get this very clear, well, not very clear, you get a seemingly clear trend of increasing pressure with increasing elevation differential. And there's a whole bunch of assumptions that are going into this. I know that water utility A is not running their pipes from the lowest point up all the cliffs to this tiny house sitting on the peak of a mountain in their service area. They probably got a well. You're running them where you can run pipes. So the service area elevation differential is not a perfect variable, but it is something that's useful and easy, relatively easy to calculate. And it kind of creates this relationship up until a certain amount of pressure. It looked like things really start plateauing at about 120 PSI for logical reasons. The water utility does not want to run their system at a pressure where someone turns on their tap and just blows water out the roof of their house. There are limits on what you can send into a house unless you want pressure reducing valves at every residence. You want to keep your system at a relatively nice level. So that kind of makes sense why it would plateau. But this was just, again, really interesting to see. I've kind of touched on why all this is important. It's just the water resources in the basin. It's what we have is what we got. There's a lot of infrastructure in the basin. There's a lot of dependence on the water. It's really just kind of the comprehensive view of what we've done. So with that, I am done. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
Sorry, that was like a fire hose. It was so much, but I think I got through it.
That's perfect, Michael. Thank you so much for that. We do have two comments, one from Alan and one from Kate. I think Alan is more like a discussion that is really important. Let's just address Kate's question first so you can answer faster, and then we can start debating with Alan. Kate Stanton is asking, after this extensive analysis, how do you envisage, it being used by the basin's water utilities?
So I don't know that the water utilities will rely on this analysis as much as folks concerned with the bigger picture. They're still using the AWWA version 6. I think it might end up being more how we can interact with individual utilities to help improve things moving forward, because it gives us a better idea of, like, for that example with looking at the interactive data grading results, like, where's the low hanging fruit? You can call someone up, be like, hey, you said you were guessing at the pressure in your system. Do you have like a gauge you could look at maybe somewhere? Things like that. I think looking at the economic level of leakage is something on my bucket list that I would really like to see not be on a bucket list and be more of like just an imminent goal, right? Because that would really help basin-wide planning of like what's achievable versus what's realistic versus what's theoretically possible. I would like to think the utilities are looking at this, but I don't know.
Okay, so I'll address Alan's comments here. He's saying that he has several comments, suggestions on the frontier analysis methodology. Your report looked at the use of curly. Any comments? And do you think you might develop an economic model for target settings? So
the two things, curly, yeah, there were a couple other things, as Alan mentioned before the call, even that I didn't get to touch on in here. Curly was one of them. We just kind of like threw the data using that combined real loss indicator to kind of just see what it looked like. I didn't have as much background or I don't know, understanding of what it would mean, like looking at the curly plot as I did with ILI. Like I understood what I was looking at, reaching an ILI of 1, right? I know what that means. With curly, it was a little less clear to me unless I correlate it with ILI and had a curly value, which would be like the lower limit. So we really didn't do much with curly other than just kind of like throw the data at it and see what it looked like. It was a relatively short section, but it was in there. And there were other things as well that I didn't get to touch on, like looking at differences in source water via groundwater, surface water, looking at the difference, whether utilities are public or private, which was kind of interesting, trying not to call folks out, but there were differences when you have investors versus not. There might have been others, but it was a big report. So that was the first question. The second question was, refresh my memory. Sorry. But what was the second question? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Do you think you might develop an economic model for target settings? I can
Oh,
assist the use of
no.
curly if you like.
Yeah,
Alan,
I'm
you can
assuming
unmute
that's
yourself if you want to talk to him. Just feel free to unmute yourself.
I assume that's kind of like what California has done with UC Davis or something, with this like model that calculates an ELL value. I'm interested in just seeing what that looks like in terms of our systems. I haven't had time or the resources to get into it.
Yeah,
It's a
I
tool that's
understand.
out
I
there.
understand.
A lot of people went into it. So I certainly won't ever discount what they've done. It's very complicated. It's not DRBC's initiative to go down that road that I know of.
Okay. Yeah, no, it was just a question. I'm not advocating that you do that, but there are sort of simplified methods and then very complicated ones, you know. So, but in a lot of cases, ELL models have been done poorly. So, you know, and the guys at the Texas Water Development Board have said to me, we're not going there, you know.
Yeah.
So, just a
Yeah,
question.
that's kind of the boat we're in. I think it's very interesting. I would like to see how it looks. I haven't had the time. My perspective is more of like a program with the utilities to do it themselves and to actually look at their own systems and understand what is economically feasible and helping us with the long-term planning and things like that. Availability model I kind of alluded to.
Well,
Really.
there is a sort of simplified way of using Curly and the variable production cost to get an equivalent of the loss cost rate for real loss, like is used by AWWA. And in fact, I sent you a paper that has a description of that. But anyway, I mean, have a look at that paper. That's for those on the call, it's a paper that's being reviewed by a smaller group at the moment, but I intend to circulate it after I get some comments. But I did want to make a few suggestions on the frontier analysis, and by no means is this a critique. I think this report is fantastic. I mean, it's very thorough, very well done, and I'm very impressed with the work. But in more recent years, I've added other variables into the set of explanatory variables, which then takes you away from a UARL line at the bottom. And I've found in some cases that the water consumption is highly significant in predicting the amount of leakage. And in some cases, the variable production cost is. In other words, if the utilities are awake and they have high VPC, they'll bring their leakage down. That's not true everywhere, but so that takes you away from a UARL as a bottom point or as a target, but you can use a low frontier, which is evaluated using the standard frontier analysis technique. So, you know, it's fine to do it with the UARL if you're trying to measure against it, no problem. But there are alternative ways of doing the frontier analysis, which, you know, maybe with time it could be looked at. And
Yeah, we very explicit, like in the report and in our analysis, we just kind of picked those variables and went with it. We didn't do any kind of like giant matrix of, comparing every variable against each other, some covariation analysis or anything. We just kind of went for it. And I think it was actually like when we were done, like we hadn't done the ILI analysis or anything. We kind of did the frontier analysis just thinking that was going to be it. And then it kind of dawned on me or us at some point. I was like, we could just do this like simply at the end. So then that's kind of where the idea of cross plotting, just observe real loss in URL and looking at ILI and the real loss reduction, that kind of came about at the end. So it wasn't even planned to be included. It kind of came out because we did the frontier analysis. And I definitely can understand why financial variables would be important you know, as
Yeah, and
dry.
I was surprised by the consumption factor, but it may have to do with size of pipe and, you know, things like that. But one thing, and I don't want to start a debate on ILI, but with the UARL 1999, there are pressure boundaries within which that's considered acceptable if you do not use the SCF. And it would be interesting to filter out or just look at those points that are within the, what is it, 45 to 60 meter pressure? I can't remember, Kate, where Alan would
It
know.
was like 40 to 85 PSI or something.
Yeah,
like that.
yeah. Anyway, again, this is not a critique. It's just like, what would it be like with that, you know? And,
Yeah, we did, what did we do? Oh, I mentioned, I just threw, the UARL equation at everything. Yeah, I don't think I filtered it based on the number of connections or the pressure.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Well,
Good.
AWWA software doesn't really do that according
yeah,
to
I did
what's,
it externally. I did.
well, I know, and
Basically ended up taking all the input data and running all the calculations externally because it was just easier. We did it all in, you know, a computational language. We use R. It's just much easier to
Yeah,
do data
yeah.
analyses. So the inputs are really what we cared about.
Okay, fine. There's other questions. I should be sign off or stop talking and let others
I
talk.
appreciate it.
Okay.
That's great.
Michael Wilmot is asking, going back to the start of the presentation, which shows increased losses during COVID, how confident are you in your consumption data? Because lots of utilities saw consumption rise during COVID, which is not accounted for, would increase reported losses.
Oh, like the total volume over time that they're withdrawing. I don't, if I can recall, I don't know if there was a big trend upwards in the consumption data. I would have to look at it. So off the bat, I can't answer that. I think it was. I'm looking at the report. I'm cheating. Here's some consumption data. So this blue bar is the withdrawal, the volume from owned sources. So there was not really a large tick up over time. I'm just comparing it against state data because you wouldn't want folks withdrawing stuff from their sources at the state level to be, you know, just data checking. So it doesn't really look like it would correlate with the volume from owned sources as much, just off the bat. I guess it was probably a change in rate if you look at the per connection rate as well. So I don't know if that answers the question.
That's fine. That'll do. Thank you, Michael.
Chris Lauber, as a utility, we would like you to develop a simplified ELL model as a guidance tool. Any comments?
Well, yeah, I don't think I would develop it, but I mean, you're saying as a utility, you would like the simplified ELL model. I think it already exists, you know, UC Davis put it out. I looked at the paper and it was just a couple inputs. And it spits out an ELL value for you. But I haven't played around with it enough to really be able to speak to its results, maybe.
Okay.
I don't know,
Alan
Chris, chime in if that answered your question or not.
Alan Lambert commented that regarding ELL, the off-water regulator in UK has spent almost 30 years trying to get ELL to work satisfactorily, but a few years ago concluded that it was not challenging enough and have asked the utilities to now calculate UARL. These are just some comments, and Kate is saying that UARL 1999 pressure boundary is 45 to 60 meters and equivalent PSI. And Alan is saying that the WRF 4695 report has a precise description of an ELL model, real and apparent losses. Yeah, I think this is a debate for another big meeting about ELL and everything. But regarding the presentation, I don't think we have any more comments. And
Yeah, I would just, for the ELL, I threw that in there. I didn't know it was gonna get such a, such attention, but it's really just the thought of it, right? Where I'm showing these plots, I don't know if I can like back up real quick. I'm showing these plots here, like this one, or maybe no, this one's a little better. Showing this trend of withdrawals, right? And then I'm stacking up the most recent year. And then it's basically just showing if everyone above a 10 were to get down to a 10, what might these gray bars look like in the future, right? And I just wanted to highlight that we understand you're never getting down to that bottom green line in ILI of 1. Because you got old systems in the basin. There are like 2 systems that were established before the American independence in 1776. I mean, we're talking old systems. Obviously, those pipes are not still in service, but I'm just saying there are some older systems and they're never getting down to those limits. It's just practical. And from a planning perspective, knowing that and being able to quantify that are 2 different things. So if we can find a way to better understand basin-wide, what is like a realistic expectation? Is it a 5? Is it a 7? Is it a 3? Is it a 10? Like, I don't know. It would be helpful. That would be a really helpful tool in our toolbox, so to speak. So that's why it came up, just to reiterate.
Okay, that's perfect. I think that is it for now for the questions, and we are ahead of time. Not ahead of time, time. Michael, I'd like to thank you very much for this great presentation. And Alan is clapping his hands. And thank you so much. If you want to say something, and just goodbye to everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good seeing you all.
Thanks, Michael.
Okay.
Bye now.
Bye.
Great job, Michael. See ya.
Thanks. Bye.